Today, I'm finally going to have a conversation with Made by Jimbob. If you enjoyed this conversation, definitely go check out his YouTube channel. He has lots of great work. Go subscribe to him. I'm sure you're all familiar or have seen the cartoons that he makes. I'll have some on screen right now. I think they're really smart and intelligent memes that tackle religious, philosophical, and political topics. On his YouTube channel, he does lots of debating atheism, evolution, scientism, and he's done debates on the Crucible and Fresh and Fit, and I think he does really good because he goes for the presuppositional approach and he doesn't grant the opponent anything, and he's really getting to the core of the argument. And he's really good at impersonations. I think the comedy aspect really adds.
Sounds out of your mouth, according to your view, is no different than fart sounds?
Well, that's not what we think. You know, I am Dildo Dawkins. I know more than you. Yeah, that's Crabbies. Crabbies came from the previous Krabby. We came from a whaley whale. There was a whale. The whale, because of its blowhole, we know that it was on land first. And it had a large mouth, and it was what it did is it sat on the beach, and it waited. It waited, and it opened its mouth, and it waited for the buggy bugs. You know, so that mechanism, once it decided to turn into a raft temporarily until it grew fins, and then it ate the plankton.
Thank you so much for coming on today.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
Yeah, these cartoons that you make, how did you get into that? And you've seen a lot of success with that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I was always into art. I just never knew what to say. There seems to be a correlation between artists and being sort of atheistic or leftist leaning. Yeah. And you just kind of figure out what to copy, and then you don't really know what you believe. Yeah. Well, I was always artistic, and so when I started doing comics, I started commenting on just basic pop culture. It actually, one of the first viral memes was about Game of Thrones. It had nothing to do with philosophy, had nothing to do with religion or anything like that. And I saw that there was a promise in using a meme, either a single frame or a multiple frame, to really cut through all of the noise of communication technology, media, entertainment, and have people really understand and internalize something palpable. And as I went along in my cartoon career, so to speak, I started realizing, wow, I have something to say, but I need to get clearer on what I'm saying. And so that led me into a philosophical route. Wow. And then I basically came upon Jay Dyer through another podcast, and they were like, you're going to like this guy. And so that was my intro. And I was like, oh, yeah, it was like a whole other world. It was like cutting through brush, and, you know, there's a sunset and a pond, and you're like, oh, I never really got into these bigger questions. You know, what is truth? Who is truth? You know, from a Christian view, how do people know things? You know, I just granted myself all of these things. Then I was like, oh, I can use philosophical questioning and inquiry in my comics. And once I merged those two, that's when I saw the explosion of success, relative success as a comic artist. So
wow, that's amazing. And were you ever an atheist, or you always kind of believed? Yeah, so what happened with that?
Well, I was raised, basically went to like a born again church. You know, the pastor had a ponytail and a red Fender guitar, and there's like a push button and the floor opens for baptism and stuff. So I was always a little like, what is this? And the jumping around of churches that all did different practices, whether I knew it or not, looking back, I saw, oh, there's a weakness. They don't have a solid tradition to transfer that's uniform. Yeah. And so I went away from that when I moved to like Los Angeles in my early 20s, you know, doing what young men do when they run away and defy God. And I did that for about 15 years, but I was like cliche spiritual, not religious type. I was a bit new age, you know. I had drawstring pants. I pretended to like kale and yoga. I went through that, and again, this all led me back to bigger questions. You know, I basically played around with you know, Vipassana, meditation, and this kind of stuff. Wow. But once I started asking bigger questions, I was like, okay, I know I'm not an atheist. Like, that's absurd. I knew I took for granted that we have minds, that there are metaphysical and immaterial aspects to reality. So which view is going to account for these things? And that pursuit of truth just led me exactly down the path that I'm still on right now.
Wow. Awesome.
So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Glory to God. And so
Yeah.
you kind of were interested in philosophy and the big questions, but it wasn't until Jay Dyer when you started to like, oh, that term, or like I've never heard it talked about so like in depth and precise.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, he uses a lot of fancy philosophical terms,
Mm-hmm.
and people get lost in the density of his work a lot. But
Mm-hmm.
once I just kind of got a grasp, and that seems to be in favor for me. People go, "Oh, you're so there's something approachable how you do your philosophy," and I argue. I talked to Father Deacon Ananias about this, and
Yeah.
my advantage is that I'm still novice in it. So I don't get lost in like this really crazy web, right? I
Yeah.
don't know the history. I don't really get into the schools. I just look at really fundamental things. And that's something I
Mm-hmm.
definitely took from Jay, is looking at very basic assumptions, very, very rudimentary starting presuppositions, because everyone has them and they all lead to certain conclusions. And there's one thing that stuck with me from his all of his talks and things, is that there's a very limited amount of starting positions, and
Mm-hmm.
because of that, there's actually a very limited amount of outcomes, or places you're going to logically go, even
Yeah.
if you dress them up with different outfits, different rituals,
Yeah.
whatever, different names. Once I saw that, I was like, wow, doing cutting, sharp, philosophical countering.
Mm-hmm.
That's all you really need, is those to know to attack the pillars,
Mm-hmm.
and attacking those pillars and other views led me to, okay, well, which view accounts for the pillars?
Mm-hmm.
Forget
Yeah.
attacking the pillars. Which view accounts coherently for the pillars even existing in the first place? That led me to tag presup argumentation.
Yeah. And it was through just listening to a lot of these lectures and debates that you picked up on these. And you're like, it takes a long time for me too. I know I still watch them and they go over my head sometimes. But when it finally clicks, it's easy to apply that. See expert apply it and then articulate it in your own way. And you've had a lot of success with that.
Yeah, yeah. I think my approach is similar to Jay's. I'm aggressive. I might even take sometimes a too arrogant personal approach.
Mm-hmm.
But overall, what I'm doing, and that's my style of debate. If you've ever seen me debate, it's
Yeah.
basically interrogational. It's attack, put them
Yeah.
in the corner.
Mm-hmm.
I don't grant them anything.
Mm-hmm.
I'm learning a little bit of the opposite, where you grant more and let them devour their own view. Sometimes that's more effective, but
Yeah.
it's my impulse to attack those starting positions, and there's definitely a way to do it where they have no ground. I mean, I tried this stuff out. I called Matt Dillahunty. I don't know if you've seen that clip where
I
got him
did
to
see that.
deny his mind in like a minute.
Yeah.
And
Mind is an emergent property of the brain. Does that mean a mind is physical, distinct from the brain, or
Mind doesn't exist.
identical?
The
so that's what's kind of funny and humorous about it. I think looking at it from a humorous position,
Mm-hmm.
it might still get really intense and combative. But if you're looking to produce some absurdity as a conclusion from your
Yeah.
opponent, that's really useful online, because you could clip it, you can do all the silly internet, novelty stuff. And
Yeah.
so you've seen that too with your own work, right?
Yeah, definitely. And so when you say starting point, I've noticed that a lot of people, you can bring up that there's certain starting points that they're starting with, and it's like they don't even understand that. Like when we interpret the world, we have a starting point, we have presuppositions going into that. And so a lot of the naturalist, people do a scientific discipline. They think, oh, well, I'm just doing the science and I'm not, I don't need philosophy. Like they don't realize that, hey, in order to do the scientific method, you're kind of assuming a lot of things about the universe. And so how do you go about kind of unpacking that?
Oh yeah, that's a good one. That's actually something that is coming up this week. I'm battling some of these naturalists, empiricists, scientismos, I call them, because scientism and science are distinct, but they're blurred now. My approach is my first trap that I like to set is asking them straight out, is science the best method to truth? This is a trap. This is clickbait. This is a cheap trick, honestly. But it works because the impulsive atheist naturalist scientismo will just say, yeah, of course it is. Science is, that's why I hate religion. And I hate, and then you go, okay, great. So you just made a claim science is the best way to truth. If that's the case, and that's a truth claim, can you produce that as an outcome in the scientific method? They say then, what do they say, Kyle? You're playing word games. And they go into their thing, right? So it's a good way to trap them. I like doing that, just showing the limitations. Science can't account for, like you said, the philosophy of science, the metaphysical assumptions, mind, regularity of nature. I've learned to take that specific little realm of philosophy overlapping with science. And I've even developed, and I don't know if I'm the first, but I developed a way in which the naturalist has to, if they're consistent and honest, accept one miracle. Through an argument I've made out. I said basically this: like, I ask the atheist if a miracle based on their view is something that definitionally can't be explained by the regularity of nature and physics. And they say, yeah, that's pretty good. Okay, great. That's premise one. So basically, anything that exists that can't be explained by the regularity of nature and the laws of physics would be miraculous, right? And they say, oh, yeah, totally. They don't even see the trap. Well, the conclusion is the regularity of nature and the laws of physics, the very existence that they're interacting with, can't be explained by those things. Now, what you said before, Kyle, is a lot of these people take this self-evident approach. Well, I don't have to. It's just self-evident. No. You granted yourself regularity in nature, that the world is intelligible, that your mind happens to operate seamlessly, for the most part, with the external world, that there's universal concepts we all share and communicate. They just take these tools for granted. They take it so that's the only way reality could be. Well, that's not even logically true. There could have been a reality where the universe was ostensibly unintelligible, popping in and out of existence, not maintaining their identity, just constant flux, like truly constant flux. Well, I've gotten a couple atheists to just say, all right, I'll bite the bullet, Jimbob. There's one miracle I'll grant that can't be explained by the laws of physics and regularity. That is the very regularity and laws of physics I'd be using as the standard to negate any other phenomenon. So they're granted the regularity from their view. They're granted laws of physics and engaging with their mind with these things. But once you ask them how you get those things, the answer can't be from those things, right? The regularity can't produce the regularity, right? So it's a good, I always jab them in the ribs with that if I can. So feel free to borrow it and change it however you'd like.
And I think it's interesting because a lot of these atheists aren't even familiar with like the skeptical tradition, because these questions were brought up by David Hume. I mean, this is, the problem of induction is why, the regularity of nature that we just assume it ends up just being a circular argument on their worldview, viciously circular. And so bringing up that they're believing in a miracle, then you can start to, once their worldview starts to crumble, then maybe they can be open to other ways of thinking.
Yeah, and it's hard sometimes because they just don't see it. I mean, the modern atheists we engage with now, I mean, you've seen it, Kyle, like some of these not even the major channels, some of the lower channels that go after me in some of my videos, they literally are saying things that would have them have some sort of philosophical medal or lanyard, at least, saying they've debunked Hume, right? They're like, no, that's easy. They're like, you assume the regularity of nature, and so do I. We don't have to justify it. No, that's not how that works. Like, just because both of us assume it from our worldview, that doesn't mean we're making an account for it. It means that it occurs that way. And the whole problem of induction, they don't think about how taking a bunch of particulars out in the world and coming to some general conclusion, in this case about the future being like the past, say, is the most popular one. They just grant that there's particulars in the world that maintain their identity and behavior. It's like they basically say, like, duh. And I think this goes into a larger problem that I'm not entirely well versed historically in, but generally, which is just the general Enlightenment school that our country is mostly found on. There is a correlate, I would even argue, a causal relation between what we see now as academic and philosophy. It's a garbage. It's like empirical naturalism. I mean, determinism. All of these things are open, and they're all based on these fundamental assumptions. I would even say my criticisms of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, this concept of rights itself, it still impacts politics today. This notion that oh, we'll just start from obvious things. It's basically Descartes, but for everything, right?
Yeah.
It's like, I think therefore I am.
Yeah.
Regularity, therefore regularity. Mind,
Yeah.
therefore, they just keep running with this. It's a disaster from my view.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember when a lot of these random like atheists would respond to my videos, and when they're talking about logic, they're just like, "Oh, it's not actually real. It's just like it's a description." And so
Right.
if logic is just a social construct, then and it's not real, how am I going to prove that God is real? Everything just ends up being a social construct, and social constructs there's no ethics to that. It's just
Right.
kind of there's just power. And enforcing social constructs on other people versus we believe that they're not just social constructs, that they're actually real.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's the question is what's real. I did
Yeah.
one of my videos. I have a series, I'm up to 3 that really trigger these atheists online because I purposely call it arguments against atheism. I know that's clickbait. They lose it. But one of those things is questioning, well, their arguments for God's non-existence is rooted in this assumption that anything that's real must be empirically verified with sense data and you can touch and smell or watch it or something.
Yeah.
Well, I point out that that's not even true.
Mhm.
For example, the laws of logic, as you mentioned, they always say, well, they're just descriptive. Well, what description is identical to the referent that it's describing? For instance, if I say apple, the word apple, the sound apple, the concept apple is not identical to the object. So when they say descriptions, well, that's not actually true. So if any of you listening come up against your atheist friends or enemies online and they say the laws of logic are descriptive, well, no, the laws of logic, the thing being described, those 3 classical laws, the descriptions of those things are not identical to the things being described. In fact, from the atheistic naturalistic view, evolutionary view, the laws of logic must have been upheld and in effect for evolution to even happen to produce the mind, which then allows for these linguistic descriptions of those laws. They're basically saying they're not real, and yet if for you to say the laws of logic are not real, you're basically saying they're immaterial. But to say they're not real means that from the evolution perspective, that all of the mechanisms in play that preceded the human mind from their view, how can you say those are real?
Yeah.
Now by the way, you're engaging with something called the past. Is the past real?
Yeah.
Well, evolution is a past-based phenomenal claim, right? So it's funny how they deny the past. Again, Matt Dillahunty denies his mind. The consequence of taking this ultra real physicalist position is so absurd. I honestly, Kyle, I'm not well studied enough in philosophy. I have no idea how it got its root and got any legs at all. How is it not swatted down as being the most clownish position ever? I have no idea still.
Yeah, I don't understand. How it's just gained this mass popularity, and I think one of the easiest ways to kind of poke a hole at an atheist starting point is ethics, because even the most simple, most complex people, everyone has an ethical worldview, and even very smart people will have this like ethical worldview, but they don't really question their starting points or presuppositions. I remember when I used to be like an anarcho-capitalist, arguing with my anarcho.
Oh man, that might be worse than an atheist, Kyle.
Yeah, well, it was when I was an atheist, but it's like you have this entire ethical system, and I never asked the question like, how do I know any of this? How do I know that this is actually correct? And so, like, when your atheist friend says, "Oh, that's wrong," denying women's access to abortion is wrong. It's like wrong. What are you talking about? Where's the physical evidence for that? And all the atheist philosophers and scholars will still make this basic mistake of like nothing in the world is. You don't get a ought from that just because you see things in the world. It really is like crazy how it got this far.
Right. Or at best, they'll take an intuitive approach. So even from the Christian view, what they're thinking is intuition, we would say is a more written on our hearts for the lack of, we don't have the full language. We have to be reduced to something like that or in orthodoxy or nous. But from their view, it's intuition. Well, that's interesting because across time, what seems to be an intuitional conclusion about reality is that God exists.
Yeah.
So they don't like
Exactly.
that part of the intuition,
Yeah.
but it's true. Like the ethical problem,
Mm-hmm.
another thing that's tied to the ethical or meta-ethical problem
Mhm.
is why ought we pursue truth at all, even
Yeah.
if we granted, which we don't concede, truth is a description, right?
Mhm.
Okay, fine. I'll grant it. I don't concede, but let's go with truth as a
Mhm.
description. Why is it the atheist is saying you ought to abandon false beliefs? What if we granted all of
Yeah.
Christianity and all the religions were wrong? Well, their reasoning would ultimately be utility based if you
Yeah.
really press them on it. Well, what's interesting about this is that it's logical, or it's even demonstrable, that believing a false belief from that view produces good utility.
Yeah.
So this is why you're getting
Exactly.
right. This is wouldn't you say this is why we're getting the Jordan Petersons and the Richard Dawkins,
I like Christianity. I like all the paintings and hot cocoa,
Yeah.
but I just don't like all the people who built the things, the
Yeah.
cathedrals.
Now you're taking a practical, pragmatic, I would even argue a technological approach to religion
Mhm.
or theology. Well, obviously we argue against that, right? Internally.
Mhm.
We would never even entertain such a thing. But as far as arguing against these people,
Mhm.
you can grant that stuff and say, great, religion's a technology. Why ought I not use a technology? And then they say, well, it's because it's false beliefs. And you go, well, what if false beliefs produce uh, uh, flourishing?
Mhm.
Okay, should we believe them? Though they have to say yes. They have to.
Yeah, exactly. And I think I see a lot of them. They have a lot of these, wacky kind of beliefs, denying free will or veganism, but or saying there's no ethics, but they think there's like a virtue to it. They're like, I'm willing to say what's true, even if it's hurtful. But it's like there is no virtue on your system. There's nothing better about what you're doing, because it's all just kind of random, meaningless chaos. I mean, why would any of it ultimately matter?
It would be meaningless. It's
Yeah.
actually, their view is so bad, especially those strict materialist physicalists, because
Yeah.
I still to this day haven't got a good counter argument or good counter critique from the argument that if everything is an effect of physics,
Mhm.
then all beliefs are effects of physics, all propositions are effects of physics. How could one effect of physics be right or wrong? I still haven't gotten an
Yeah.
answer to this question from the atheist. It would be equivalent categorically to water boiling as an effect of physics and our brain fizzing. So from that view, how are you distinguishing a good effect of physics, a better effect of physics? So they accept the proposition, the first premise, everything, including our thoughts, are all effects of physics,
Yeah.
propositions and everything. And then you go, well, how do you determine between the two? And they don't seem to get that whatever method they say is also an effect of physics.
Yeah.
Like so
Exactly. Yeah.
and then they spurg and yell at you, and then I don't know. I sometimes I
Yeah.
give these people way too much charity as far as my ear listening.
Yeah.
I don't give them charity in the arguments, but
Mhm.
just listening, I'm like, am I stupid? Like,
Yeah. And what I've seen is that a lot of people, like, besides like the atheist, philosophers and the pop atheist apologists, most people do believe in God, or they're this kind of like deistic, where theistic evolution, but I don't believe Christianity because evolution and the age of the universe. And so how do you critique that kind of thinking? Because a lot of people were taught from a very young age that the universe is billions of years old. They used to say 14 billion. It's been up to
Right.
20,
They'll just change it.
27 billion. A little
Give
bit
me
off.
more time. More time seems to be the theme, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Especially the theists, like critiquing Christians in particular.
Yeah.
I start with that because
Mhm.
most theism outside of actually all theism outside of Christianity is going to break down in their philosophy. Mostly their epistemology is
Yeah.
going to reduce to empirical or things or nature things
Mhm.
in nature. And so for the Christian, even the umbrella Christian, that would include all of the modern
Yeah.
takes. If they argue evolution, then what they're saying is, even though scripturally we're made in the image of God, that means we're made in the image of God. So, image of God, you know, uh, contrary to most atheists believe, that has nothing to do with our outline of our body, our contours, or elbows, or something like this. That's a feature, the fact that Christ became man, fully God. But as far as the image bearer of God as a status in Christianity, I would love to debate someone like Inspiring Philosophy on this, who I think holds this position, and I don't want to like misrepresent him, but you're really in a bind here, because the image bearer status, according to an evolutionary view, needs to happen at some arbitrary point. For instance, if you were once a beast, that means you weren't made in the image of God at that point. So they have to say then made in the image of God happened after creation. Now, you still have a problem with death before the fall and stuff like that, but that gets into hermeneutics a little too deeply. It's actually out of my wheelhouse, and but this part of it is actually fairly easy to argue, which it goes something like, if we're made in the image of God, but from that view, the image bearer status comes somewhere between beast and man, they have to tell you from their theological position where and when that happened. Because if image bearer status includes an ethical position, it includes a deontology, it includes a telos, a purpose, it includes moral culpability. So animals don't have moral culpability. We don't judge animals the same way we judge a human being in their actions. So I would ask someone like that, okay, where's the point man suddenly acquired this position where he's morally culpable, where he needs to repent, where he needs to confess? Can you imagine just the prototype of human just before human who's confessing? Did the apes confess? Like, where was it a pseudo confession? Like, did they almost say it? Did they almost repent? And this is a big problem. And I think their basically their defense is an ignorance position, or like a mystery position where, well, we don't know. And this applies, it might even apply to, I haven't actually seen him pressed on it, William Lane Craig. He's kind of phasing out, I guess, of the culture debate now, because he's getting older. But I don't know if he takes that approach too, and he just rests on, well, that's just, a mystery. Well, that's not a good enough position if you're going to teach and advocate for your Christian belief.
Yeah, exactly. And another thing that, the core of this kind of presupposition, or like the thing that they rely on the most, is time. Just give it, 14 billion years. Now it's 27 billion years. And that just makes the magic work. And so how do you critique that? Because it was interesting. It was interesting for me, being raised, atheist, only knowing, the Darwinist perspective of seeing how the different dating methods that they use, and they're just not reliable at all. They have these, like you're talking about, assuming this regularity in nature and extrapolating it way, way, way in the past beyond anything that could be justified.
Yeah, well, you can go after the dating methods themselves. One fun way I do it, without getting too far into the details, is just ask, what's the margin of error? And then once they say the margin of error, I ask them, what's the margin of error on that? And then they think I'm playing a game, but really I'm asking, how would you know the margin of error of 14 billion versus 11 billion versus 35 billion? Would it even matter? And my second approach to that is simply asking them from their scientific paradigm if time is an independent variable that has causal effects on nature. Now, in an experiment, we generally have a colloquial sense of time being a variable, even being called an independent variable, that time permits something or not. For instance, like if you leave milk out, it's not time itself, some magical entity that rots the milk, but time permits for the bacteria and the heat and everything to happen, right? So I ask the person, is time a causal variable in this phenomenon you call evolution, or the beginning of all time and space and matter and all this? And someone who says time with enough time, they're essentially saying, I don't know the causes, but I know if you give it enough time, those causes will exist, even if I can't name them. Well, they're just arguing from ignorance at that point. So that's my first two-step process. Get them to bite the bullet on time. And then I for fun, I try to get people to argue that time rots milk. And I think that's a humorous, a microcosm of their larger argument, isn't it?
Yeah. And the thing is that if you're always just following the latest science, they say science
Mm-hmm.
discovered this. It's
Yeah, sure.
constantly being updated. You're not like getting objective truth. You're getting something that makes sense in the specific model with all these
Mm-hmm.
presuppositions that they haven't really justified. And science can be useful, but it needs to be in its proper place. And that's the problem, is they're putting it. The theistic evolution proponents are putting it above these other presuppositions that should really be justifying the science in the first place.
Right, and it brings into question what science is. They've been able to sneak in a new definition of science, which includes a body of knowledge. Right. Well, that's question begging, but regardless, if science is a method, I get into this debate a lot. Even today on my stream, and yesterday someone called in and they were arguing evolution, and I said, okay, they asked me, well, what does evolution say, the theory? Because I deny it's a theory based on what the scientific method is, and what a theory is, which is a theory is something that is produced by the scientific method. It comes after all of these steps, and they agree. So they say, well, the observation, what did he say? The changes in allele frequency. So the question ends up being, what's a scientific theory for me? That's the way I argue it. And they say an observation is made. And then I ask, well, what's the hypothesis?
Yeah.
And that's an important question. And it gets them every time, because what ends up happening is they state the observation. And then when I ask them what the hypothesis is, their brain freezes and they end up trying to restate the observation as the hypothesis again. Well, that's not science. So this question of what is science, what's a viable hypothesis, how do you demonstrate something you said, Kyle, modeling. This is a huge problem in modern science as it's taught. Is what's being taught now is that modeling and simulation is a sufficient substitute for an experiment.
Yeah.
And this isn't true. This is not true. A model is not a sufficient substitute for an experiment, but they're teaching that it is. And so if you have a model and the model is described with math, this is another thing they sneak in. They think math is explanatory. They sell math as explanatory. It's not. It's descriptive. You and I can describe an accurate concept of a unicorn giraffe hybrid that flies, right?
Yeah.
Now the math description might be totally consistent, right? And it makes sense, but it doesn't mean it's real. So that's a big problem. Modeling is one problem, which ends up being mathematical.
Yeah.
And this idea that a model can replace an experiment, the only arbiter for two competing hypotheses is an experiment in natural science.
Yeah. Like you can make explanations and models to prove anything. Like you could prove it that eventually, given enough time, we could start to shoot Spider-Man webs out of good enough time. And if you just have random mutations, why isn't it possible? I mean, anything kind of becomes possible on this worldview where, any cell could really, if you give it enough time, its ancestor could evolve into,
or a man could be a woman, have a baby.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And there's like some scientific discoveries, like the James Webb telescope.
Oh man,
it's been wrecking all of their like things that they've predicted, and it's just then they just reinterpret the data to fit their existing worldview. It's like they find these universes called like galaxy breakers and things like that, and then it's just reinterpreting it, and it's like, oh, all the science we had before, it was wrong, and that's a good thing. And it's like that's why we don't put our ultimate faith in what you're promoting. Yeah,
you're always leaving it up to some description, and really the value of science has mostly been the null hypothesis, where you determine that what you thought was the case isn't the case. That's just as valuable as the one that supposedly confirms the likelihood of that theory. So when you evaluate something and suddenly you weren't right, you can't base your entire epistemology on science, because that's ever changing. But that's what they have pride in. They're like, yeah, but I'm okay with it ever changing. You're a Christian and you think truth is absolute. Well, interesting enough, now academia is mostly founded, not even founded. It's actually turned into what's called standpoint theory, which is this assumption that the viewer, the particular class or color or experience, the rainbow, the Skittle people, everyone has a different experience of the past and what the truth is. And
Yeah.
standpoint theory basically puts someone in their own custom driver's seat to then look at the past and interpret history through their special lens.
Yeah.
Well, this reduces truth to relativism, which is ultimately I would even say, Satan, that demons would want you to be a relativist,
Yeah.
because the truth then becomes based on your wants, your desires, and you can just change reality by describing it differently. And it's really a Faustian deal, as we've seen.
Yeah, definitely. And one thing a lot of people get caught up on is they see kind of like little examples of what they think proves this grand macro evolutionary theory. Like they're like, oh, look at the different dog breeds. Therefore, if you give the single cell enough time, you give the old fish enough time, it will turn into a man. And it's like they don't realize how big of an extrapolation that is. And so what would you say, random mutations versus like, dog breeding and things like that?
Yeah, I go to the mechanism. Posh Redneck. I debated
Yeah.
with him against Richard Spencer and JF Gary a couple of years ago, and
Yeah.
where we really pounced on them is what's the mechanism? I always ask, what's the mechanism? And
Yeah.
it becomes circular. You go, what's the mechanism? They go, random mutation, sexual selection or whatnot,
Yeah.
change in allele frequency. Okay, so if that's the mechanism, what is it that it's doing, and can you explain how it's doing what you're claiming it's doing at this macro level? And they could obviously never do that. It's a massive assumption to say, because these changes happen at the local level or even at the population level, that means it must be happening to the point where species spin off and become unrecognizable. Well, this
Yeah.
is a massive jump. This is a basic composition fallacy, really, that I even think that Darwin wasn't prepared to support, because he had no idea about genetics and genes and DNA. He was just looking at basically superficial traits
Mm-hmm.
within a group of species. And
Yeah.
I think what happened is they got a better look at the baby inside a womb and saw like, oh, there's a little thing that you try to call a tail,
Yeah.
and then it changes inside the stomach, and they go, well, if it changes inside the stomach, it must happen over millions of years. And this is composition fallacy.
Yeah, definitely. I think there is definitely a connection with like ancient pagan philosophy where it's kind of like, things are constantly changing. I think it is like they have those presuppositions, pagan presuppositions, and they're like making pattern recognition where it doesn't exist. I think that there's some truth to that.
Yeah, I would even say, and I think Jay has done something on this, is that the new pagan approach that might not have any education on the old pagan, the new transhumanist view or technological sort of worship view, it kind of does mimic that old view. It just kind of transposes it onto a new god, a metal god, or a biosynthetic metal god.
Yeah.
And everything's changing. Hence the Troon thing. It's interesting that correlation between the pushing of that people can be different, whatever they want to be. Well, that would include animals then, that you have no limits of what you can and can't be.
Yeah.
Wait until they have the helmet world, Kyle. Like I always make this joke that like these people who want to invent what they are and who they are based on language, they want nothing more than to be able to be seen that way. So I imagine a helmet world, a virtual world where they can go in and be this weird hybrid pig snake unicorn or whatever. But the irony is that everyone else in that world can just decide how they want to see that person too. So it'll be like they'll be like, oh, I finally got a virtual world. I can be whoever I want. But then it gives the other user like, you're actually a lamppost to me. Like I don't even see you. Like they don't see that part. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's really interesting. The Coom pod and where they're going to go with this. Luckily, I think it's definitely a few decades away. Like the metaverse and everything. It didn't really look that good now, but yeah, it'll be interesting if everyone making their own hyper reality. Another thing that people bring up is there's all these fossils and the missing link and what I think they don't understand is they don't actually like look into the specific fossils. Often they're just finding like fragments, something that looks kind of similar, so they're like, okay, this we have a puzzle, it fits in here. And those also rely on the dating methods to just fit it like perfectly, and they think it really it makes their whole model work. It's like we have all these fossils, they look kind of similar, so they must, be related.
Yeah, it's confirmation bias. I mean, I've had a couple of engagements with these people who specifically around what they call transitional fossils. And it's interesting that we're dealing in a time where people claim they're another gender and they transitioned and then it's definitional. It's because they declared it so. Well, it's very interesting that when you go in and try to find a fossil, by finding it and it representing the thing you were looking for, you just declare it a transitional. Exactly. I always ask these people, okay, besides calling it that, I ask them a simple question, and sometimes I have to use an example. I call it camel world. But the question is, if the fossil you found, everything about it was the same, how would you determine it's not a transitional fossil? Because that's the opposite question that's never asked. It's like, if you ask, how do you know it's transitional? They describe the fossil. And they go, well, it looks like this and shares this thing and it shares that thing. And you go, well, what if it was all the same? And how would you determine it's not? And they don't have an answer for this, which means they can't falsify their claim that it's transitional. They just name it that. Now, to get it into an example, I use this example all the time. It makes them crazy. I imagine a world where a society is aware of camels, but they're unaware of some sort of different breed of camel that looks camel-y, right? They've never seen it before. They've only seen the full camel that we know. Well, they dig and they find this other camel-looking thing, and they declare it so. They have a celebration. They cut the ribbon. We found a transitional fossil. Well, the hypothetical set basically says, well, let's say in a distant country like Tanatuva or something, the natives dig up the same fossil that looks like a camel but's not, and they celebrate and laugh, but you think they're going to say transitional fossil. No, they just say that's a llama. We found a llama. Now, the difference is that the one group of people know the distinction between a camel and a llama, so they know what they found. The other is looking for something that's similar, that to say that it was the old version of this one, that it branched out into this one. Well, I present this camel world and I go, well, how would you basically determine if those two hypotheticals could exist at the same time logically? One group knows it's a camel versus a different species or something, and the other thinks it's a transitional. Well, if they can both exist at the same time, all you're really saying is that we found an animal that died out, but could have lived at the same time as this camel, right? It could have. It's not this assumption that it once was, and then it became this other thing. All you need is a hypothetical where it could technically exist at the same time. Now, the evolution proponent might say, well, it could exist at the same time, but it's still a preceding version of it. Well, no, that would just be asserting the claim again. Right. So then what good would the fossil give you, right? At that point. So
They ultimately have no way to verify of what they're claiming is actually true, because both of those camel societies, that they have a presupposition about it, but and they have no way to tell who is right, because you can't ultimately go back in time.
No, you just name it with language, Kyle, and then people go, it's a transitional fossil, and they repeat it. Well, what do you mean transitional? What? You're just naming this thing.
Exactly.
Tell me what's not transitional. By the way, I asked someone, is there any fossil that's not transitional? Of course they have to say no, right? So to call something a transitional fossil is useless if every fossil is transitional.
Yeah, exactly. And I think a lot of them are missing the aspect that, the understanding the geopolitical and societal agenda behind promoting an ideology like this, because it undermines traditional religion, what they say are myths, and it promotes nihilism, that, we can explain everything. But even on their worldview, they're assuming so many things, and they're having all of these, they're giving names to these things that they have no way to verify. They're trying to construct this worldview as a weapon, I think.
I think so. I think they deny there's a spiritual warfare happening that then basically uses culture as its medium, and the world as its medium, and we have that those distinctions within Christianity. We have these distinctions in the world, not of it.
Yeah.
This is a natural realm. There's another element to this realm that we're called to participate in. And they don't have this. What you just said, most of these nihilists, most of these secularists would just scoff and say, you're wearing a tinfoil hat, essentially. They just say, oh, you think there's culture creation? You think there's social engineering? Well, it's documented. Of course there is.
Exactly.
I would even admit that I want to participate in it. If I want the Christian culture to prevail or to at least maintain itself, even if it's at a small degree, that's basically advocating for crafting society in a certain image, like that would influence our art and our architecture. I mean, that's something I talk about that's completely lost. Is that some of these things you're talking about? I mean, look at how the brutalism that's introduced in architecture, the gross darkness, it's icky and wet looking. Does that make sense? It's cold looking.
Yeah.
Now that has an effect on people. I mean, we know this because you can test the experiences people have generally in huge sample sets, what they feel like when they go into a very square-like building that's mostly beige or cement, versus going to an Italian piazza where it's open and there's arches and there's beauty and there's statues made in the image of greatness or whatever. That even the flawed theologies that built sculptures and castles with the assumption of praising false gods are still better.
Yeah, they are. Really.
You know?
Yeah, I think that's what started to wake me up from atheism, was seeing the fruits of, atheistic thinking versus Christian thinking, is that the greatest things were made to glorify God, and we see the fruits of this atheistic society. It really seems like there's kind of like an elite that are trying to, sell you this ideology that you're kind of just a soulless animal. You're not made in the image of God. Your life is meaningless. You don't even have free will, so you're just determined.
Your mechanism, yeah.
Yeah, you're gonna live in a pod, and you're gonna eat bugs, and you're gonna be happy doing it. And and people are rebelling against this because it's being forced on people. And the more you understand, how these things are funded, and that's why I think, Jay is good at talking about, these aren't just conspiracy theories. Like, they write about the agendas and things that they're trying to promote for social engineering. There's no reason to hide it when they have all the power and they can write about it, and then people will go out and defend it, and they'll say, it isn't happening, it's not happening. It's happening, but it's not that big a deal. And then it's happening, then it's a good thing. That's how all these things go.
Yeah, you just get them to read the goals. I mean, you can't launch all of these policies and try to construct this kind of world that's strictly mechanistic with a bunch of John Calhoun mouse experiment people like in their little chambers or whatever. You can't do that without assuming that we ought to get to some place. Yeah. So the good news is that even those people can't get away from this teleological impulse. So that actually points to Christianity, because what else justifies that we have this impulse of a higher purpose? Even the Satanists and these technocrats, they still have this philosophy that's much like Plato's Republic, where they are basically saying, well, there's these official unelected masters of there's a symposium of us, and we're in the position, the obligation to direct humanity, right? They think this. Well, this is a religious belief. It's not a Christian. They're just borrowing and twisting it. But so the good news is that even those people are reflective of a Christian view. They're just twisting it and inverting it. And I always point out, well, even Yuval Harari, who's like, well, rights don't exist, and we only need to make a society that the AI tells everyone to be gay on Tuesdays. It's like, well, even that view is a metaphysical statement about the future. And so the good news is they can't escape it. And the good news is that when you force them to say it, if you can get them on the phone or on a stream, you can challenge them and show them that it's bankrupt, and that's a beautiful thing. That's great. But you're right. Something you said about architecture and all this stuff we're dealing with. We're basically in a strange iconography battle. If you look at it, like all the grossest things are still some counterfeit gross iconography of, let's say, the world.
Yeah.
Where we're fighting for iconography of Christ, of the church, of the heavens. And those things can demonstrably be more beautiful than the other things. Like, notice how all the iconography of nihilism and of subjectivism, you could even go back to some of the modern art, even Picasso, this impulse to put the nose on the elbow and the eye on the ear and all that, I'm going to rearrange reality. Wow, you're so edgy. It's so dumb and short-lived. The only place you can go to with that is further down the rabbit hole of dysfunction. I call it Dadaism. That Dadaism made a resurgence with the AI world, and everything's disformed, and that's cool now. And look at even the worship of the people, God bless, whom were born with nubs and no legs. Like, they're celebrating the flaw as the standard for beauty, as opposed to, no, you acknowledge the flaw as a fallen aspect of the world, and you are called to help the flawed. Yes. But they're inverting it. They're putting the flawed up on the podiums. You're getting, Down syndrome, Victoria's Secret models. I mean, it's going to get really gross in a lot of those arenas. Yeah. And it's iconography. It's like their perverted view of iconography.
Yeah, I think that's why Dostoevsky said beauty will save the world. Because, the good is all tied together, with Christ and the church. And they promote all this ugly stuff because it's a spiritual war going on. I mean, most recently we saw, in the Paris opening ceremony, they have a bunch of drag queens. It's like, who wants to see this? Like, what? Paris was built by people who believed in, higher ideals, like these, beautiful churches, even though it's not orthodoxy. They still built a lot of beautiful stuff because they believed in objective principles, objective beauty. But the more and more they get away from that, we're just going to see the fruits of their ideology. And people don't preserve buildings like that, like the ugly buildings. No one wants to preserve that.
Yeah. I mean, think about it, if a building is an extension and an icon of a belief, right? In our case, our houses, the church, these things, even us as humans are icons. Yeah. If something's replaceable, what is it an icon of? Well, it's an icon of a philosophy that's ever changing in flux. I mean, isn't it perfect that everything you see today is built to be replaced, including now they're trying to get humans to be seen as replaceable widgets, man, woman, no distinction, replaceable widgets, human beings and animals, no distinction, replaceable widgets. Yeah. So they do a decent job at proliferating a higher volume of their perverse iconography than we do in proliferating ours. So that there is an actual in the world fight there happening. And again, I don't think we win a spiritual war. I don't think we can practically win the proliferation war, and that's fine. I mean, we can't overproduce because the world's going to produce more than us, right? Yeah. The worldliness is going to represent more, but that makes it all the more special to find the narrow view, and that makes it so hard and also beautiful, is that we're drowning, each of us, even if we're in the church, even if we're practicing, we're still drowned. Yeah. We leave on Sunday and we're drowning in all of it, right? We're just basically treading water.
Exactly. Yeah. Wow. That's beautifully said. And so my last question for you is, what are your future plans? Do you plan to just continue doing what you're doing? I think everyone, if you enjoyed the conversation, go subscribe to him. I love how much depth you go into on all your videos. Is you'll watch these super long, atheist compilations, evolution compilations, and you go into every detail and nothing gets left. So.
Yeah, my plan is a little more humor. Like, I've gone through a sort of a debate phase. I'll still debate, but my skills are really satire, analyzing something, but trying to infuse it with some funniness, even if it gets serious sometimes. I'm trying to get back to a little bit more of that. and I plan on doing more comedic stuff, more skits, more animation, more creativity, because our gifts, we got to use our gifts. And so if one of those is laying on the shelf, I feel like I'm doing a disservice anyway. So
Yeah. No, I love your channel. I feel like it's so underrated because the streams are so long and a lot of people, the people tune in live, but just like there's so much great orthodox content, or like in the sphere content, and people just don't have the patience to sit through that long.
Sure.
But I love your short videos too. I sent them to people.
I'm trying to do more of that. I'm a little behind on the curve where it's like obvious you're supposed to do like clips, but again, it's just me and my wife, and we're trying to figure out like, okay, how do you get the clips thing going? And so now I'm trying to engineer my setup right in OBS and stuff, so that it's the easiest thing to do to make a clip of something. But you're right. I don't even plan for things to go like 4 hours. I look up and I'm like, wow. There's an advantage, and I'm trying to do even a 2-hour segment, and then and obviously making more animated content, and the impressions and animating the impressions. I think people love that, so I'll be focusing a lot more on bits of content.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, I'd love to collab again in the future. I know you're inquiring into the Orthodox Church, so if you do get received, we can have another conversation on that. But it was a lot of fun. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it, Kyle.
God bless. Bye.
Yeah, you too.